What's up, guys, and welcome back to another podcast episode. And today, I was looking through some of the things that I was kind of interested in terms of running and what I could research and some of the things I could bring to you guys and maybe try to share some of the things I've learned and teach you guys. And one of the things that I was very interested in was the biomechanics of running, or just the biomechanics of movement and running patterns and that sort of things. And I was like, how can I share some of the things I've learned with you guys and try to research some stuff and bring to you guys some of the things I've learned. So today in this podcast, we'll be looking at the biomechanics of running and how we can improve our biomechanics and how we can increase our performance in running. So when I was researching the topics of this episode, there was two main questions that I kind of had in mind or that I created when thinking about this topic. So firstly, I wanted to look at what is the optimal biomechanics of running. So that is what's the most efficient way we can run and increase our biomechanics. And secondly, the second question I had was, if we do not have our most optimal level of biomechanics for running, how can we maybe improve our biomechanics and how can we improve our efficiency in running? So they're the two kind of questions I had in mind for this episode when I was researching it and was looking at when I was researching and thinking about how I could create this episode. So firstly, what I'll do is kind of outline the main concept of running biomechanics and get some definitions and introductions done first so that we can go into the research that I did later on and have some terms that we know what we're talking about. So firstly, I'd like to outline what actually is running biomechanics. So running biomechanics is the science of applying physics such as forces and motions to human movement. This can specifically be looking at analyzing how muscles, joints, and bones interact with each other to make the most efficient, fast, and injury-free running. So they're like the three main aspects of running that at least I think are the most important. We want to be the most efficient, so we don't want to waste any unnecessary energy or with bad form or things like that. And secondly, we want to be fast. That's very important. A lot of people want to be the fastest they can possibly get. But I think the most underrated and the most important one is injury-free, because they kind of impact the other two. If we get injuries, then we can't train and it kind of messes up our physical and mental health a bit when it comes to running. And so having injury-free running is probably one of the most important aspects of this, I think. So they're like the three main points: efficiency, speed, and injury-freeness, or not having injuries. So when looking at having or trying to optimize for these three things, some of the things we can help focus on are the gait cycle, foot strikes, cadence, posture, joint motion, and any energy reduction. So we'll go into defining some of these terms that I just mentioned then, because there's a lot of them and they might not be the most common sense. So some of these key components, the first one we'll look at is the gait cycle, which is just the cycle of movement of our legs. So how we're moving through our legs when we run. So there are two main phases of the gait cycle as a concept. The first one is the stance phase, which just means whenever our foot is on the floor. So obviously both our legs touch the floor at some point, and our body spends 60% of the time in this phase, where it's 60% of the time with our foot on the floor. And the second phase is the swing phase, which is the opposite, whenever our leg is in the air. So that's roughly 60-40% between the stance and the swing phase. And the goal of the entire phase or the entire gait cycle is to just maximize efficiency between force on the ground or ground contact time, and then recovery time in the air where we don't have any forces applied to our body. The second term or concept that we'll be looking at is foot strike patterns. So you may be aware of some of these foot strike patterns, such as the forefoot, heel, and midfoot strikes. So they're just the three that we'll be looking at, and they're kind of self-explanatory in the name, where the forefoot strike is obviously you're landing on your forefoot, the heel strike is you're landing on your heel, and your midfoot is landing in the middle of the foot. So I'll kind of break down some of these types of heel strike or foot strike patterns, I mean. So we'll start with the forefoot strike. So that's very common in sprinters, obviously landing on the forefoot of your foot. So your ball of your foot, your toes. Like I said, very common in sprinters. However, this does increase tension and strain on your calves and your Achilles, which is the backside of your legs. So this is a very common injury in sprinters or people who use their forefoot strike. The second type we'll be looking at, which is probably the most common I feel like in terms of running, is the heel strike. This one is kind of the opposite side of the leg. So the front side of the leg has a lot of tension and strain. So this increases shock in the knee, in the shins, and it can go all the way up through the ankle, the knee, and could affect the hip as well. This is probably, I would consider, the least efficient and the most injury risk type of foot strike. So I would highly recommend leaning away from the heel strike, but unfortunately I found that especially with beginner runners or people starting off, they tend to subconsciously lean to the heel strike, and then it is hard to get out of it once you've started making that a mental pattern of using your heel strike as the go-to running pattern. So if I could recommend moving away from the heel strike, I would very strongly recommend that. But then the last type of foot strike is the midfoot strike, which, as the name suggests, is landing on the midfoot, the middle of your foot, obviously, where you're striking kind of balanced between your entire foot, and this is very good. It's kind of a middle ground between the previous two, where the one is very strongly towards the front and the other is really strongly towards the back, and kind of balances them out with a nice middle foot movement, where obviously balances the strain and the impact and the forces going into the through your body, and reduces joint stress in the ankles, the knee, the hip, and all through your body as you run, and is probably the most beneficial in terms of reducing injury and increasing efficiency. So I would recommend that, moving maybe away from the heel strike and to the midfoot strike, but I guess everyone's has different body types and muscle types and bone types, so whatever kind of is the most pain-free for you, I guess, is beneficial. And then some of the other things we'll look at is cadence and stride length. So you may have heard a lot that you need a high cadence and a high stride length to get faster, which was one of the three points that we wanted to increase with our running. However, this is not necessarily the case. It kind of depends on the runner and depends on the distance, because something that I have found is that different distances and different levels of running requires different levels of cadence and stride length. So cadence is just how many steps per minute you are taking, and then stride length is obviously the length of your stride. And we do not want to end up overstriding, because that could cause injury, but also we want to find a long enough stride length that we can cover more ground and hopefully increase our speed. So that they're the kind of two ways we want to look at it, where overstriding can increase the rate of or the risk of injury, but also too short of a stride length can obviously shorten the distance, or the distance covered over time, which is kind of the speed aspect of it. So finding a nice middle ground for each person can help increase the best chances of improving speed whilst maintaining injury free, which are some of the two aspects that we're looking at. So some of the stats that I found for elite level stride length, not stride length, cadence levels for elite level runners is in sprinters, their cadence can get up to 250 to 260 steps per minute, whilst middle distance runners, so that's maybe the 800, 1500 mile type of distances, maybe even the 3000, can get up to 190 to 220 steps per minute, whilst elite marathon runners can get only around 180 to 190 steps per minute. So many people have probably heard that you have to hit 180 steps per minute. That's like the golden standard of cadence, and if you're anything under that, then you're not going to increase your speed. And I feel like there's a lot of clickbaity kind of social media posts out there that always like have to be hitting 180 steps per minute as like the golden standard. And whilst for elite level sprint runners, the lowest cadence level is the marathon runners, where they're hitting 180 to 190 steps per minute. Whilst they are all hitting that level, I do feel like for maybe sub-elite or beginner or intermediate level runners, obviously these numbers are not going to be representative of those groups of people. So do not necessarily take 180 steps per minute as like the golden standard. Obviously adjusted for you, it is different for each person. Each person has different size legs and different stride lengths and cadences, and it really, I do think, depends on the person. So I do not think there's like a hard and fast rule that each person should try to follow, and it depends on the level and the person and other factors too. So it really does depend on how fast, or like the distance, or how fast, or whether you're a beginner or intermediate, or maybe closer to the faster level groups. So it really does depend on what kind of distance you want to adjust for. So then the next thing we're going to look at is posture and leaning. You may see some people leaning really, really far forward, or having their shoulders rolled forward, or their head really far down or back, or people looking really unnatural when they're running. So what many people kind of do is lean, I feel like, hinge too far at their hips and then lean forward at their shoulders, and the whole body starts to lean forward like that. And that is probably not the most efficient and does waste energy. And you may have heard that also on social media, which there is some truth to a lot of the social media stuff, but I do feel like a bit more nuance is required. A lot of people say you should really focus on your core to help keep your body straight and aligned, so that you're not leaning way too far forward when you're running, and decreasing your posture and your core strength, which is, there is truth. Obviously you do want to increase your core strength and stay upright, but you don't want to be too far upright where you're standing up pretty much straight when you're running. I found some research that said there is a possibly between, I think it was 10 to 15 degree lean forward, where you want to be leaning slightly forward. You don't want to be standing up too straight when you're running, otherwise there's no momentum moving forward. So there is a slight lean, like forward leaning posture that you want, coming from your hips, leaning forward from your upper body. But don't want any side to side movements or complete bent overness or any other sways in leaning or posture that might decrease your efficiency when running. And then some of the the last point I would like to get into or concept is force distribution. People I found, or a lot of people have discrepancies either between left and right or side to side force distribution between their legs or other types of force distributions that may affect their running style. So one of the big things is ground reaction force, which is obviously the force you put into the ground when you're running. So this obviously impacts how you land, your foot placement, your foot landing position, I guess, and obviously if you have any discrepancies between your left foot or your right foot, then you might be putting more force on one side, which means you might be leaning further to one side to counteract the force balance, which if you want to try to maintain injury freeness and more efficiency, then maybe balancing out any possible ground reaction force differences between your left or right. Now obviously you're not going to get it, I don't think it's possible to get it perfectly even between the two. You might obviously have a tiny bit, but some people I'm sure there's studies that have been done that on participants that have had such a large amount of discrepancy between their left and right side that causes injuries in their knees, ankles, hips, or just decreases efficiency in one side or the other. So force distribution is very important, how much force you're putting on each side. And to straighten your body, I think that force distribution is linked to the posture and the leaning, so side to side movement. And so then they're all the components of running biomechanics that I could think of to outline. And then you may be thinking, why does this actually matter? Why is it important to have good biomechanics? Yeah, just have good form. Why does this matter? Some people may say, which is fair, because some of the things that I found of why biomechanics is important is understanding these principles allows people to minimize the efficiency and energy. So any vertical movement, any side to side movement that helps or that decreases efficiency, try to minimize these energy expenditures. Helps reduce strain on the body, helps reduce any common knee running injuries, including knee problems, ankle problems, shin problems, possible hip problems if there's alignments there. So helps with efficiency a lot and helps with common running injuries that everyone complains about getting. If we help maybe improve people's biomechanics, then these things will be hopefully fixed with a bit of time and energy focused on it. So some of the common biomechanical fixes that can take place is in improving posture. So that's some of the things that have worked for me personally. I'm not sure these are all representative of everyone, but some of the things that I have worked on is trying to keep my head not too far up, but like I've noticed that especially when I'm getting tired, my whole head and shoulders lean forward, which is obviously not ideal. We talked briefly in the posture and the leaning where you want to keep from your head to your hips straight without leaning forward, and I feel like I definitely started off rounding my back, lowering my head, which causes my whole body to kind of curl over, which is definitely not what the recommended form is for most people. They want to keep their shoulders back, the head up. But then I also noticed like too far the other way where I'm really trying to focus on keeping my shoulders up and my head up, and I tend to lean too far up the other way where I'm like really, really leaning backwards, which yet again kind of goes too far the other way, where you're leaning back and forcing your body backwards. So obviously there wants to be a slight forward lean in your body, but straight from your head to your toes. That's something that's worked for me, and hopefully can work for other people. Obviously, increasing cadence without overstriding, because the cadence and stride length are linked together. A lot of my runs where I am going faster, so my speed work, I have noticed the statistics being higher stride length also increases the cadence, or higher cadence also increases stride length. They're interlinked. So, however, you don't want to overstride where you're then ending up heel striking, and then that causes possible injuries that we talked about before with shins or knees or ankles, or other types of injuries. You want to make sure you can do the greatest level of stride length whilst still maintaining mid stride or the mid-foot strike. That's what I always find, that once I can get a bit too far and end up landing on the slightly back of my foot, and I can definitely feel it personally. So obviously different runs or different types of runs can differ in cadence and stride length. For example, my long runs can end up being closer to only 130 centimeters or 1.3 meters in terms of stride length. However, some of my some of my speed work can get up to close to 1.92 meters stride length, and then obviously the cadence increases from about 160-ish to 180, 190-ish in my speed versus long runs. So obviously different types of runs can require different levels of stride length and cadence. So obviously adjust and maintain the right level of cadence and stride length for you in whatever run type you're doing, because you don't want to, obviously you want to adjust for each type of run. That's at least my personal experience in these sort of things. And then the last thing I wanted to get into before getting into the research was the difference between kinetics and kinematics. So these are just difference how motion is analyzed and how human movement can be analyzed. So I'll start with describing kinematics, which describes motion without any forces involved in the movement. So it's only looking at motion. So this can be something such as displacement, velocity, and acceleration, where you're just looking at how an object is moving through space without any forces applied on it. However, kinetics is looking at the causes of motion, where force and torques, which is how much muscle forces are applied to different conditions or different loads, such as gravity or ground contact time. So the difference between kinematics and kinetics is the involvement of forces, where kinematics do not involve forces and is only looking at motion, whilst kinetics looks at motion whilst applied to, or looks at forces applied to motion of an object. So this can be looking at different impacts of gravity or ground contact time or other things that involve forces on said motion. So that's a bit of the introduction and looking at the terms and describing what could we look at for optimal level of biomechanics, and some of the personal things that I do in terms of improving my biomechanics and how I've possibly done it. Now I understand that I want to preface that is purely specific to me, and I don't want to give anyone false hope or different types of judgments without applying it to yourself. Do not necessarily take what I do and apply it to yourself and your running, but maybe some useful tips if it helps. So now what I want to do is get into the research of it and the actual research that I found from studies and different literature. Okay, so one study looked at which movement patterns are most closely linked to performance in highly trained middle distance runners. So in the study, 11 elite male runners completed overground running trials on an indoor track, while researchers used three-dimensional motion tracking and analysis to measure their running mechanics. So performance was assessed using both season best and personal best in the 1500 meter races times. So on average, the runners were moving about 7.2 meters per second during the test. Their season's best 1500 meters time averaged just under 3 minutes and 50 seconds, so extraordinarily fast, with their personal bests being slightly faster than that. The analysis showed three key technical factors were strongly linked to better seasonal bests and performances. So one was a smaller range of hip motion during the swing phase. So in the gait cycle, a decreased hip movement, which means less forward flexion of the trunk and toe off, and a less plantar flexed ankle at initial ground contact time. Together, these variables explain nearly 96% of the differences in performance. So then for personal best times, two factors stood out the most. One was the reduced hip motion during swing phase and smaller plantar flexion angle at foot strike, so accounting for almost 80% of the performance variation. Overall, it meant that slower runners tended to land with a more pointed foot and a greater forward lean of the trunk. So, like we were talking before in easy terms without using all the fancy stuff, so it means the trunk, the torsos were leaning too far forward, and people were pointing their toes on ground impact time in general, which meant they were landing more on their forefoot. So in general, it meant that people were leaning too far forward, had a too great of a forward lean, and they were landing too far on their forefoot when running. Based on these findings, the authors suggest that coaches and athletes should pay close attention to ankle, shins, and trunk positioning during training, as small, very tiny technical adjustments in these areas to help optimize middle distance running performance. Additionally, another study that I looked at examined whether biomechanics of high-level endurance runners could serve as a model for improving running technique in recreational runners. So this was looking at transferring between elite endurance runners to more recreational runners. So this study, researchers compared the running mechanics of 14 high-performance runners and 14 recreational runners across 4 running speeds. This used detailed kinematics and kinetic measurements collected during overground running. Statistical analysis was used to assess differences between each group, the influence of speed and how key movement variables could interact between one another. So the results showed that high-performance runners used a distinct gait pattern. They demonstrated a higher vertical velocity of the center of mass and spent 11% more time in flight compared to recreational runners. High-performance runners were also more likely to use a forefoot strike, landing with their foot closer to the body's center of mass and generate larger ankle movement. Importantly, these differences were largely constant across all running speeds. The analysis also revealed a strong independence between biomechanical variables, suggesting that running performance is influenced by an integrated movement pattern rather than isolated factors. Overall, the findings indicate that elite runners maintain stride length primarily through a longer aerial phase, so that's the swing phase, um, rather than by landing with a more extended knee. Their authors suggest that further training interventions could explore whether recreational runners might benefit from reducing their lower limb inclination at foot contact time or to improve running efficiency. So further research does need to be done, but these were the types of researches or studies that I looked at on how these elite athletes how the times or biomechanical factors of these elite athletes can be transferred to other athletes as well. Running economy is a key determinant of endurance performance. So, like we talked about before, it reflects on how efficiently an athlete runs and is influenced by a combination of biomechanical, neuromuscular, metabolic, and cardiovascular factors. Some of these traits are genetic or inherited, while others are developed through training. So for a long time, Kenyan runners have been very dominant in long distance and marathon type runs, which has prompted a lot of research to be done on these types of factors on these runners and how these could lead behind their exceptional performance. So another study conducted a systemic review which examined biomechanical characteristics associated with running economy and performance of these runners, with the goal of guiding future research and coaching strategies. So a lot of these determinants of biomechanical characteristics of these Kenyan runners could help develop general strategies for coaching of elite athletes or just general population athletes. So the strongest finding from this review was that the longer gastrocnemius Achilles tendon, which is your tendon between your heel and your back of your calf, is clearly associated with superior running economy and performance. This conclusion was supported by a meta-analysis of 3 consistent studies. A longer Achilles tendon allows for greater elastic energy, so the pulling and energy storage, and reduced muscular fatigue, which improves efficiency. So unfortunately, this is a genetic characteristic or a biological characteristic that cannot really be changed in terms of training, but is something that can be looked into in terms of performance. This review also identified several other additional biomechanical traits that may contribute to Kenya's running success. This includes maybe their slender and taller build with lower body mass and BMI, longer and slender limbs with mass distributed closer to their hips, additionally with the longer Achilles tendon, tissue and arms, and shorter foot levers. So that means their ankle levers are shorter between their foot. Whilst these factors show consistent trends across studies, the evidence was not strong enough to make definitive conclusions. However, they may still play a factor in their performance. Finally, elite Kenyan runners appear to exhibit shorter ground contact time and flight times, along with lower ground reaction forces during running, which may further enhance their efficiency compared to other distance runners. So, looking at this may include things like, in terms of training, being able to reduce your BMI. So generally, leaner people can run faster. That applies to not just Kenyan elite runners, but general running. Lower BMI does also generally increase running performance or running speed, along with things like lower ground contact or ground reaction force and ground contact time, which just means how fast you ground contact time is how fast you make, or the time spent making contact with the ground. So if you can reduce your ground contact time, which means faster turnover, which generally means faster cadence, and generally linked to longer stride length, like how we talked to before, also meant that higher cadence, faster or longer stride length does also increase speed, and along with other factors also increases efficiency or running economy. So those parts of that the study did demonstrate increased performance and can be trained or done in training, whether that's reducing BMI, increasing strength, or more technical stuff like trying to increase or decrease ground contact time and increase your stride length and cadence. So overall, the findings suggest that both structural characteristics and running mechanics play an important role in exceptional running economy and performance of Kenyan elite distance runners, and this hopefully can be part of some research to go to transferring away from just Kenyan runners to other groups of runners, or away from elite runners to other groups of runners as well. So, okay, so this is the end of the podcast. This is all the things that I kind of took away from the research that I did on the biomechanics of running, and hopefully some of this can be transferred to your life, and hopefully some of these tips and things that I maybe did for myself or learned or could share with you guys could also be transferred to your own types of running, and maybe help you guys want to learn a bit more about the biomechanics of running, or how you can improve your own running form or optimal running style. So I will leave a link to all the studies that I used or looked at in the description below, and hopefully maybe you can go look at some other studies, or maybe share some of your findings in the comments below, or share any other things you want to maybe would be interested in me looking at or researching or finding. Just have a bit of a discussion. I am also very, very interested in some of the things you guys want to learn about or think. So let me know what you guys think. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the podcast. And I'll see you guys later. So peace.